Welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Allison Hout, and it is my honor to serve as the president of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. For 50 years, the League of Women Voters of Illinois has been a proponent of the graduated rate income tax, or fair tax. The fair tax is the way to give our state the financial ability that it needs to fund education, higher education, and other important human and social services. This is something that we need to have in an equitable manner for all of Illinois. We are glad that you are here to learn so that you, as a trusted source with friends, family, and community, can be an effective proponent for the fair tax. When people hear you explain and advocate for the fair tax, it will be a positive influence on them. And now, Bill, Ann, and Jean will take us through their excellent education on our fair tax plan.
Welcome everybody to today's presentation. I'm Bill Kale from the League of Women Voters of Illinois. I'm part of the Issues and Advocacy Committee. I recognize that you're spending a lot of time Zooming these days, and I thank you for adding this screen time to your lives. Joining us today are Jean Pierce and Ann Corter, issue specialists, also with the State League of Women Voters. Here's what we're going to do today. We'll go through the current PowerPoint, and during this time, we'll be sharing some personal stories and an elevator speech and answer some frequently asked questions. First, we'll look at what's wrong with our current tax system. Then we'll talk about what exactly the fair tax is. And we'll talk about what the fair tax will do for us in Illinois. And finally, we'll discuss how we can actually pass the fair tax ballot measure. And this is where we need your help. The League of Women Voters belongs to a coalition of supporters of the fair tax, working to educate our communities about why the fair tax is important to Illinois. So educational events like this, empowering community spokespeople and directing, engaging voters and working in the community, we hope to see the fair tax reform become a reality in Illinois. Our current tax system is fundamentally unfair. Millionaires and billionaires pay less in taxes as share of their income than middle and low income families. And it's not bringing in money for core services. The current pandemic crisis is both a public health emergency and an economic disaster. The crisis, as well as the focus on racial inequalities, reinforces the need to bring fair tax fairness to our state. Its unemployment rates soar because of COVID-19. Working people are in need of a just tax system now more than ever.
So just what is wrong with our current tax system? Ever since the 1970 Constitution was passed, everyone in the state has been asked to pay taxes at the same rate for income taxes. That means that our low and middle income earners are paying at the same rates as millionaires and billionaires. We need higher income rates to pay higher tax rates. So for the past 50 years, the League of Women Voters has been arguing for a graduated rate or a fair tax. Our current system is unfair and inadequate. It's unfair because millionaires and billionaires are paying less in taxes as a share of their income than middle and lower income families. It's inadequate because it's led to budget deficits, higher property taxes, cuts to schools, healthcare, public services, and jobs. This chart shows who has the ability to pay more in taxes. Income inequality has greatly increased over the past 4 decades. Most of the growth in the economy has gone to the top 1%. Their incomes have increased by 254%, while incomes for everyone else have been flat or decreasing. In fact, incomes for the bottom 90% decreased by 8% during that same time period. And yet, when we consider all state and local taxes, that means income, sales, service, excise, and so on, The lowest 20% of our income earners are paying over 14% of their income in these combined state and local taxes, while the top 1% of income earners are paying only a bit over 7% of their income in these same taxes. And this has resulted in underfunding education. Traditionally, only about a quarter of the funding of education has come from the state of Illinois, as compared to 47% of the funding coming from other states. So who picks up the rest of this? The federal government picks up a small share, but local municipalities are left with 67% of the cost of education that they must pay for. Where does this come from? They turn their primary tool is property taxes. So our property taxes are currently funding 67% of the cost of education in Illinois, compared to other states whose property taxes are funding only about 45% of the cost of education. Some people would say, well, we just have to make some cuts. We can't afford more cuts to our social services. Illinois ranks near the bottom of all states for reimbursing mental health, senior services, foster care, and other human services. Healthcare providers have struggled to serve patients. 40,000 low-income children have not received the child care they need, and 7,000 higher education jobs have been lost. We're already experiencing deep cuts. We can't afford more of them. So here's the basic problem. Illinois has a structural deficit. This means that it's made promises to fund things like education, but with our current flat tax, we do not have the ability to keep up with these promises. And this is going to get worse every year. Let's pause here and answer some questions that we often hear about the problems our state is currently facing.
All right, hi. One question we often hear is, what about the property taxes? Aren't they too high? And will the fair tax result in any lowering of our property taxes? Well, we agree that property taxes in Illinois are too high, and the fair tax will help that. Our current tax system is not adequately funding schools, as Jean just explained. Our education system only gets about 25% of its funding from the state, so local communities must fund schools through property taxes. The fair tax will generate additional revenue every year for our education system, and that will lessen the burden on communities and eventually will lower property taxes.
Another question we hear is, what will we lose if we just cut spending? Well, as I said, we've tried that since 2000. It hasn't worked. Illinois is in a massive budget crisis, and the critical services we rely on are drastically underfunded. Cuts have left our roads and bridges crumbling and our education system decimated. Cutting additional spending will only make this worse and cause more middle and lower income families to leave the state in search of better opportunities. So we'd like to pause here to share some real life experiences with you. When you're talking with friends and family, this can make the biggest impact on them. Over here on the right, you can see the services that are currently in the state budget. Actually, these are only some of them, but it might give you an idea for your story. Here is my personal story. My family has been affected by the lack of sufficient funding for education. I have a 5-year-old hearing impaired grandson who will be totally deaf by the time he's an adult. And yet, he lives in a school district that gets only 60% adequate funding. Without more revenue, my grandson will not get the level of education that he needs at this critical part of his life. Bill, do you have a story about the environment?
Yes, I do. My story is about the need to protect the Environmental Protection Agency. You can't get any fancier than that. I actually grew up next to a forest preserve and spent a lot of my time in the woods. I was practically a wolf baby, and I grew to love the natural world. And I hate to see the environment around me be destroyed. During the last decade, while environmental challenges in Illinois have increased, resources for the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency have decreased a lot. Budget and staff have been cut in half. This long-term decline has been compounded by recent reductions in federal involvement. In many areas, the government's rolling back protections and not enforcing laws. During the last 20 years, compliance monitoring and enforcement activities, data management often go incomplete or inaccurate, and community involvement has dwindled. In the middle of the forest reserve next to where I grew up, there used to be a flowing well. It was quite a natural attraction. People would come from all over to fill up jugs of fresh spring water. That's gone now. They've had to cap it off. They can't guarantee the safety of the water quality anymore. All of this is the result of a gutted budget, and all of it will get worse if we fail to pass the Fair Tax Amendment.
And Anne, do you have a story?
Yes, I recently heard a very powerful personal story that really resonated with me, and I'd like to acknowledge that it is my story too. Over the past months, with the pandemic and the protests over the murder of George Floyd, we have seen racial inequities revealed. As a white woman living and raising children in a Chicago suburb, I have benefited from some of those inequities, particularly in housing and education. Those racial inequities will lead directly to continuing disparities in income and wealth for future generations. In Illinois, the median income for Black families today is about half the median income for white families. The flat income tax that we have works to reinforce inequity. Taxing lower income families at a larger share of their income makes it difficult to save and send their children to college. We have a chance to start to fix this inequitable system and move toward greater justice by voting yes for the fair tax.
So we see that the answer to this is the fair tax. Let's talk about just what the fair tax is. What do we mean when we say fair tax? As we've said, lower income earners will pay at a lower tax rate, higher income earners will pay at a higher tax rate, and the wealthy will pay their share. This is not some bizarre concept. Illinois actually is the oddball here. The majority of states, including the majority of our neighboring states, already have a fair tax, a graduated rate. The federal government uses a fair tax system. In fact, Illinois is one of only 4 states to mandate a flat tax in our state constitution. So here's the wording you're going to see at the top of your ballot in November or as early as September 24th. Voters will also receive in the mail before the election a pamphlet with an explanation of the constitutional amendment and short arguments for and against. Note, you will not be voting on the rate structure. That has already been set by the legislature. And of course, we want you to vote yes for this amendment.
So let's look at what the fair tax will mean for us. Then we'll pause for some further questions and answers after this section. The fair tax means tax fairness for the middle class. 97%, the vast majority, will see no income tax increase. In fact, the majority of middle and low income families will receive a tax cut. Only those making more than $250,000 a year will pay any more income tax than they do right now. Here we can see the rates that will go into effect if the fair tax passes. As you can see, only those making over $250,000 per year see a tax increase. You are familiar with how the marginal rates work for the IRS. The first $10,000 which you earn will be taxed at a rate of 4.75%. And the first dollar that you earn over $10,000 will be taxed at the next higher rate. And that applies to your earnings up to $100,000 and so on. The fair tax measure also includes additional tax cuts. It expands the property tax credit from 5 to 6%. It also implements a child tax credit of up to $100 per child for those 17 and under for families earning less than $100,000 a year. So if you go to this website, FIT, it stands for Fair Income Tax, you'll be able to see exactly how the fair tax will affect your family. This chart will show our current and proposed rates compared to the neighbor states. The black line shows our current 4.95% flat tax. The red line shows what our tax rates will be if the constitutional amendment passes. The dark green line will show Missouri's rates, basically flat and higher than ours for middle income earners. And the gray line shows Kentucky's flat tax, slightly higher than ours. And the tan line shows Indiana's flat tax, which includes the county tax for Marion County. People living in Indianapolis, which is in Marion County, pay a higher income tax than people living in Chicago. And the blue line is for Wisconsin, and the light green line is for Iowa. So the fair tax will help ensure that we can invest in our shared priorities: education, jobs programs, public safety, human services, and healthcare. So let's pause here to answer some frequently asked questions about what the fair tax is or is not.
Okay, so one question is, how will this affect middle-class families? Well, the fair tax means that at least 97% of Illinoisans will see no income tax increase, and many middle and lower income families will actually see a lower tax bill. Only those making more than $250,000 a year will see any tax increases. It is likely that without the fair tax, taxes on the middle class will go up. If we do not pass the fair tax, we are stuck with the flat rate, and taxes will have to be raised on all Illinoisans, probably from about 4.95% where it is today, another percent up to 5.95%, which would be a 20% increase on everybody. The fair tax will spare middle income families while raising needed funds.
Another question we often hear is, will the legislature raise my taxes? The legislature will have the same power if the fair tax is passed as they do now. Without the fair tax, taxes would have to be raised on all Illinoisans to address our structural deficit. With a fair tax, the wealthiest will share this burden.
Well, you know, and a question we're getting all the time now is, can we trust the politicians we elect to spend the additional money wisely? Well, the league answers, if you don't trust your legislators, then you need to elect someone else. The people of Illinois still need services. They need schools, they need health care, and continuing to underfund the state will only hurt people who need help, weaken the business climate, and undermine education. This is a two-step process, really. First, we get the revenues we need, and second, you need to get to know who represents you and make your preferences known.
Many people are also concerned about the effect on small businesses. They're already hurting for the impact of the coronavirus, and they can't afford a tax increase. We agree. Unless you are a small business owner making more than $250,000 a year in profits, you will not see an income tax increase under the fair taxes. Businesses want a stable fiscal environment, an educated workforce, and a place where employees want to live, work, and raise a family. The fair tax will help make that a reality. So now let's dive into just how we can make all of this happen. It's going to take either a yes vote of more than 50% of those voting in the election, or a yes vote of more than 60% of those voting on the question. Recognize that currently it's polling at 59%. We can make this with your help. We can get 60% of the people voting on the question to say yes. How can you help? There are many ways. You can talk to your families, friends, and neighbors, talk to any clubs, groups, or organizations you belong to. Think about contacts and connections that you have. Each of them is a voter. Each of them can talk to their connections. You can join us in educating targeted voters. Text them, email them, phone them. Also be sure to use social media, You can follow the Fair Tax on social media. You can share your own Facebook and Instagram posts. Write a letter to the editor and host an event. Another powerful way of discussing this with your friends is to have an elevator speech ready to share with them. This should take about 30 seconds. Typically, that's about 60 to 70 words. It should be jargon-free. It should discuss the purpose and need for it, the benefits, consequences, and a call to action. We would like to share ours with you. Here is mine. Our best hope of funding programs that addresses problems highlighted during the COVID crisis is a fair tax. This would raise taxes on the only segment of society that has seen an increase in income in the recent decades, people earning over $250,000. That's why I am voting for the fair tax, and I hope you do too. Bill, do you have an elevator speech?
I do have an elevator speech. Mine goes like this. Do you know what the first item on the ballot is in the fall? It's going to be a fair tax. The fair tax is a way we can support our most valuable state programs and avoid further budget cuts to already gutted budget. This was true before the virus. It's more true now. By population, Illinois is in the top 20%. By spending, we're in the bottom 20%. Voting yes for this amendment will not increase your taxes, and it will raise $3 billion in desperately needed revenue. Please vote yes for the fair tax.
And Anne, do you have an elevator speech?
Yes. Our state tax system is antiquated and unfair. It places a high burden on those least able to pay. The income tax clause in the state constitution needs to be changed to allow higher rates on higher incomes and lower rates on lower incomes. With the change proposed, only people earning above $250,000 will pay higher taxes, while everyone else will pay lower taxes or stay the same. So please vote yes in November so we can invest in education and healthcare and make our system fairer for everyone in Illinois.
So here are some links that we would like you to consider in your support of the fair tax. Sign up as an endorser. Follow the fair tax movement on social media. Tell your story. Find additional resources that you can use when you're writing a letter to the editor or posting on social media. We're going to leave these links on the screen while we answer some more questions that we frequently encounter.
So we often hear, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Is this really the right time for income tax reform? And we have to say, yes, absolutely. The graduated rate income tax is uniquely suited for just this time because it affects only those with incomes above $250,000. Individuals and businesses who are affected by this crisis economically will not pay higher taxes. At the same time, we have an increased need to provide services for those who have been affected. So we need additional revenue. This fair tax is needed now more than ever.
Another question we often hear, what will wealthy people do if their taxes are raised? The answer is the same thing that they're doing now. Taxes won't affect where the wealthiest people live. Just look at California. They have more millionaires than most other states, and their top tax rate is 13%. Middle and lower income Illinoisans have been fleeing our state for years after funding for education was cut and their property taxes were increased. The fair tax will bring in much needed revenue to get our state back on track and keep these families in Illinois.
And finally, a question we often get is about small businesses. Will small business really benefit from a fair tax? And you know, 99% of businesses in Illinois are small businesses, and those are taxed as pass-through entities. Their taxes are filed with the owner's or partner's individual tax returns. For these small businesses, over 90% will pay the same or less in their income tax. Businesses, all businesses, large and small, want a stable fiscal environment, an educated workforce, and a place where employees want to live, work, and raise a family. The fair tax will address our fiscal situation and bring fiscal stability to Illinois while generating additional revenue to fund our education system and other critical programs. It will benefit all people in Illinois and all businesses.
So thank you for being with us today. We appreciate your interest and we encourage your advocacy.